Yes, welcome in to the swing. It is officially the postseason. Big Ten tournament getting going this week in Indianapolis. Selection Sunday coming up on Sunday. That would make sense. But Wisconsin, Big Ten tournament playing a little bit earlier than we expected. And that is because after being given a second chance by Illinois beating Purdue on Friday night to get that double bye, the Badgers went and all over themselves on Saturday against Penn State and fell to a team that came into the conference ranked 17th, came into a game having never won in the Kohl Center and riding the longest losing streak on the road in the Big Ten.
Yeah.
And so was it good? No, not good.
Not good. An inopportune time to have your worst loss of the season. And that was one of the things Wisconsin had managed to avoid, even if there had been a handful of losses. And certainly the Oregon game you look back on and shouldn't have blown a 15-point lead, but Oregon was at least a good team. Penn State, not a good team. They're not even represented in Indianapolis because they weren't good enough to make the top 15 in the conference. And it does open the door for more questions because the Badgers closed the regular season with 3 losses in their last 5 games. And I also think the past starts to creep up a little bit in the thought process, maybe not necessarily among the guys on the team, but certainly among us and among fans because of watching Wisconsin peak too early and then falter down the stretch. However, they still have a good shot here as the Big Ten tournament arrives.
Good shot to what?
To play good basketball. Like, it's not out of the realm of possibility.
15 teams have an opportunity to play good basketball. Like, I don't.
Well, right? Would you rather be one of those 15 or the 3 that aren't involved? No, I mean, look, Wisconsin is still set up to be at worst a 4 seed right now in the NCAA tournament. And maybe they play themselves down if they lose in the first round against either Minnesota or Northwestern. But the point I'm making here is they've played enough good ball throughout this season, I think, to be able to get it back. It's just that when you close that way in the regular season, following what has happened the last several years, there's some trepidation, I think, on the outside.
There is. So let's jump into this. Tough way to enter the postseason, I think, is a fair way to say what happened on Saturday against Penn State. And it's really not just the Penn State game. As you laid out, 3 losses in their last 5 games. Played really, really well against Washington. You knew it was going to be a tough game going to the Twin Cities. Wisconsin and Minnesota up there always is a tough game. They played well enough to win. Certainly gave up a lead, but then got it back and were able to finish. And I kind of thought that was what was going to happen on Saturday against Penn State when you go up 40-27 and you don't score again in the first half, and it's 40-35 at half. And then obviously Penn State takes a lead, just kind of like Minnesota did, and Wisconsin just did not have the answer. They got a couple times. They got to where it felt like maybe they could have gotten back in the lead and extended it, and they were unable to do that. Very similar to the Michigan State game, except that was on the road against the team that won the Big Ten, and it's 58-57, and you have some opportunities to take a lead there, and you couldn't get it done. Penn State is not at the top of the Big Ten, and the fact that they could not get past Penn State, because Penn State went and shot the lights out. I mean, right? They were fantastic from deep. They had a lot of easy looks inside just because Wisconsin's defense was not the type of defense we had seen improving throughout the second half of the Big Ten's schedule. So add all that up, and it turns into an extremely, extremely ugly loss. And it does raise the question of whether Wisconsin can get it back by whether they can find a way to play some good ball in Indianapolis, and then potentially wherever this first round is going to be. What Saturday did also was definitely throw into jeopardy being able to play in Milwaukee in the first round, because I think a lot of people had them as a 2 or 3 heading into that game, and now a lot of people have them as a 3-4. I've seen a couple of people have them as a 5, but Joe Lunardi has them a 4. And as a 4, there's other teams that are closer here that are higher seeds that are going to play in Milwaukee, and you're going to get sent to Denver or Seattle or wherever it's going to be. It's not going to be Milwaukee if you don't make at least. I don't know what they have to do, right? They have to probably beat whoever they play on Thursday, and then probably beat UCLA to even have a shot to be in Milwaukee. Again, I don't know how big of a factor that's going to be to get them back to where they were before the Penn State game. But that is as damaging of a loss as I think they've had this late in a season. And it also comes with some injury concern because you lose Nolan Winter in the game. Max Klesmit does not play, misses third straight game. The good news there is he was back on the court for practice on Monday, but there's a lot more questions than answers at this point for this Wisconsin team heading into the postseason that I didn't obviously think we would be talking about.
Very much so. Start with the Penn State game, and obviously that's the most recent performance, so we're going to talk about it, but we're obviously also going to talk about what lies ahead because there is a lot on the horizon for Wisconsin. Penn State scored 51 points in the second half. That's just mind-blowing. And yet again, as we've discussed on occasion here throughout the season, a big man just totally controlled the game on the other side of the court. And that is just another, when we went through maybe what the top 2 or 3 concerns were moving forward or what the biggest red flags are, that keeps coming up. Yannick Koenen-Niederhauser had 15 points, 11 rebounds, and 5 blocked shots. Looked like he was Shaq or something like that. That just should not happen. So those are things that stand out. You look at the shooting performance, they're missing too many close shots. They went 10 for 31 from 3, which is kind of what they've been doing throughout the year. It's just, I think they were about 10 for 27. Like they averaged 27 threes a game. But I don't look at the 3-point shooting and say that was the death knell in that game.
In that game, no, but
it has been, right? They went 5 for 32 in other games. There are obviously a lot of red flags that have popped up here, but certainly the Penn State game with what you had on the line to get a double bye, it's an inexcusable loss, frankly. I realize that they played 31 regular season games and maybe you're granted a poor performance, but not at that stage in the last game of the regular season with a double bye on the line at home against a team that had never won in the Kohl Center and wasn't going to the Big Ten tournament. So there's that. The injury stuff, legitimate concerns because it's what has derailed Wisconsin's seasons the last couple of years. Obviously, Wisconsin was able to overcome it in the loss or in the victory to Minnesota. They didn't have Max Klesmit, but I do look at that and you see the playing rotations and the way things change. That stuff matters. There's a trickle-down effect. Kamari McGee as a starter, no problem with that. He can play 30-plus minutes. He'll get you 11 points like he did. He can do a lot of really good things. Jack Janicki's being asked to play 20-plus minutes, and there are some games where he's going to help you a lot, and I don't believe he scored in that game against Penn State, right? And then you've got Cameron Hunter coming off the bench. Cam played 5 minutes, and I realize that he has not been healthy for a long time and didn't even play, last year before he transferred, was dealing with an injury. And so they kind of shelved him late in the year. He just doesn't look ready at all. But that was the type of spot that they're in. Again, if you don't have a guy like Klesmit, there's this trickle-down effect to how minutes are distributed. And I think that makes a huge difference. So that's why having healthy guys, even if Max isn't shooting 40% from 3, he does a lot of other things. That's so important.
It's huge. And Kamari off the bench is a spark plug, right? Like he's a guy that gives you a pop off the bench. When he's starting, you don't have that, right? Like, and you're right. Jack Janicki, especially against Minnesota and even against Michigan State, made some plays that kept them either in the game or were significant against Minnesota. But he's still coming along. It's still a little bit of it's a process. It's coming along. It's not something that where you can count on him to be the type of player that he was in those 2 games every single game. The consistency isn't there. But so when you have to do that, it messes everything up. And Cameron Hunter is not, as you said, ready to play. He's not. And they were at the Minnesota game, he played like 3 possessions, 4 possessions, and defensively, not necessarily his guy, but like Minnesota found openings as a result of other guys trying to help him. And so that was bad. And then, he looks very uncomfortable at trying to run Wisconsin's offense. Like there's a lot of dribbling, not a whole lot of action or even aggressiveness, which is what you need out of the guy that's going to be handling the ball like that. So he's not ready. It also kind of like asks you how far away is Daniel Freitag from playing? If that is, they're trusting him more than they're trusting Freitag. So they desperately need Max Klesmit to play on Thursday and Friday and be healthy enough for the NCAA tournament because it just does mess up the rotations. We saw that last year too when Cam got hurt. Not having that guy to come off the bench and give you a little bit of something, it definitely impacts you. the Nolan Winter situation could be even worse because they don't have anybody that you can sit there and say, come on in and give us 10, 15 minutes of play. Like, right, Marcus, be Amos, Marcus Silver, and then you'd be having to move, Carter Gilmore into the starting lineup if Nolan Winter's not able to play, and then you lose what he brings off the bench. So, again, you're right. Cam can play 30 minutes. Gilmore could play 30 minutes. They could both do that, but it takes away from what you are as a team if they have to.
Yeah, it's so important to have a built-in rotation, especially at this time of the season where you know what to expect. You know how many minutes or about how many minutes people are going to play. And again, at the end of the season, you see rotations generally get shorter and shorter, or you're leaning on your top 7, your top 8. Well, if all of a sudden you have to go to your 9th guy, your 10th guy, there's a reason they're the 9th or the 10th guy. That's not to say they can't have a big moment, but you just need some stability. And so that is in part why having healthy bodies matters, but also those are some of your best players. So you need them out on the floor. And this is an inopportune time to have this happen. With the Klesmit situation, you have to hope that the ability to finally get a little bit of rest will matter, even if he's not 100%. And I certainly wouldn't expect him to be, given everything that he's dealt with. Having him on the court at, say, 80% or 75% is still so vital for what it means for the rest of this team.
Yeah, and I think the Klesmit thing is, when we had him on a couple weeks ago, it was, talking about coming down wrong on somebody's ankle. And then when you see him yesterday, he's got a not a brace, but a sleeve on his right leg. And so that kind of looks like more maybe calf as opposed to the ankle that was bothering him. And I know he talked about getting Charlie horsed in the same place 3 times. I don't know exactly where that happened. But if it's calf, okay, I think, rest is probably the best thing that you're going to be able to do for that. So, and it sounded like on Saturday when Greg Gard spoke, I think even in the pregame about Max not playing, that he hadn't been cleared, and he also wasn't feeling comfortable enough to play. So for him to miss senior day, I don't think it was a situation where they were holding him out because it was Penn State. That wouldn't make any sense, because you desperately need to win that game. Like, I don't care if you think you're going to blow them out by 30. Max Klesmit, if he's healthy, you play him. So I think he wasn't ready, and they weren't ready to clear him. And it appears that he is now getting closer to being cleared. You would think he'd been cleared if he's practicing like he is. So they need him on Thursday desperately. The one thing that we did talk about, though, is the 3-point shooting. And I know 10 for 31 isn't far off necessarily, but it's 12 for 31, because it's still almost a point per possession, right? Like that. And that is how they still judge it. Even though this offense has been performing much higher than that, it's still almost a point per possession. But that, if you're going to shoot 31 threes, you'd like to hit more than 10. You'd like to hit more than 5. So I guess they doubled what they did from the previous weekend. That's impressive. But they're shooting like 24 or 25% of the last 5 games from 3. They're not going to go very far in the Big Ten tournament or the NCAA tournament if that doesn't pick up. Like, it's just not going to happen. They've had stretches like this earlier in the season, and they came out of it. They don't have too much time to come out of this. It needs to start. It needs to start Thursday. They need to shoot kind of like they did in the Big Ten tournament last year, where they smoked Maryland with how well they shot from deep. And it may give them some confidence and make them feel like things are headed in the right direction going into, and I know it didn't end up mattering in the NCAA tournament, but this team has throughout almost until the last 2 weeks has been playing really, really, really good basketball. The team last year faded much earlier than this one did.
The 3-point shooting at the end of the regular season is a significant concern because, as we've discussed, this team is built in a different way that the 3-pointers are going to continue to be taken. They're going to average, as they have been, 27 plus threes. I'll be shocked if they don't take that many when you get into the Big Ten tournament or the NCAA tournament, unless they're absolutely dominating in the post and decide that's where we're going to go. But it's take the open 3, get to the rim, and get to the free throw line. So you want to be able to hit, obviously, as many as you can. They still have the bodies, I think, to be able to do it. Certainly would help to have guys like Max Klesmit and Nolan Winter, even if Max hasn't shot it all that great this year. I'd still want him out there with an opportunity, especially if the shots are open. So yeah, obviously there are more red flags that have popped up. To the other thing that you mentioned earlier in the show, I wanted to bring up is the Milwaukee thing, and I'm wondering if are we making too big of a deal out of this? Like, obviously, we have the memories of the last two tournaments and what didn't go right at Fiserv Forum 3 years ago, but certainly what went right at the Bradley Center and how it can be a home court advantage. On the other hand, is it an added distraction? Now, if you're not there, it means you didn't play well enough to get there. But I just, it's certainly a storyline for us and probably a storyline for the players because they're asked about it. I don't know how much it would ultimately matter if they end up in Denver, but what it would be is you're not a top 3 seed. Because I think if they're a 3 seed, they should get to Milwaukee and you have more favorable matchups, presumably the 3-14 matchup versus a 4-13. But I wonder how important that ultimately will be for Wisconsin. We'll know the answer based on how they perform wherever they are.
Yeah. So I don't, we had Greg on and he said, it depends based on the team, right? Like in 2004, it was a hindrance because there were so many guys from Milwaukee and it felt like they were just distracted and they just weren't all zoned in and all that good stuff. They also played a really good Pitt team that day. But in 14, they don't get out of the second round without being in Milwaukee. Most of them have admitted that based on being able to overcome a 12-point lead there in the second half against what was a pretty darn good Oregon team, and Joe Young going off and going that a legendary performance from him in that, and it came for naught because Wisconsin found a way. And then injuries a couple years ago obviously certainly impacted Wisconsin's ability to win that one. But when you hear Greg talk the last couple of weeks and how big the Minnesota game was and how big the Penn State game was, he's talking, and he mentioned this seeding in the Big Ten tournament and also seeding in the NCAA tournament. And is there a huge difference between a 3 and a 4? Only depending on where you're playing, at least in my opinion, right? Like for him, he's like, we want to get the best seed possible in the NCAA tournament because he knows that if they get a 3 or a 2, prior to that loss, that they would be in Milwaukee. And I definitely think it's a huge, huge advantage to be in Milwaukee. You don't there's a huge difference between Milwaukee and Denver and you know what I mean? Like, or playing in Seattle. So I think it's a huge, home teams do well for a reason for the most part, right?
Well, I was just asking the question about whether we're making a bigger deal out of it than it is. We should be. I'm not saying we are or we aren't. Obviously, the Milwaukee thing means it's a byproduct of playing well, and I think that's the most important thing. Yeah, the home court advantage that can matter, though. Again, it's a neutral site. It's not like Wisconsin plays there very often. They play Marquette there, so it's not like the venue they're familiar with. But certainly, we have seen what it's like to have the backing of the fan base. But I do think it matters from the standpoint of if you earn that, it means you've played well and played well down the stretch. I suppose there's a situation where you could go backwards and sort of backpedal, but still end up falling forward. But if they don't play well, it means they're a 4 seed and they're out of Milwaukee and you have greater concerns. So it would be nice for them to be in Milwaukee, certainly. It's been a interesting talking point here the last month of the regular season, and it'll be interesting to see how much it ends up mattering.
Well, we won't. If they make it, we won't know if it wasn't a problem, and if they don't, we won't know if it was a good thing.
Well, if they get to Milwaukee and they play terribly, then we'll say well, they could have played terrible anywhere. If they get to Denver but they make the Sweet 16 for the first time in 8 years, you say, well, they were good enough. It wouldn't have mattered where they play. But yeah, obviously they're hypotheticals because we won't have the answers to the other side.
Right. So the 3 seeds that potentially knock Wisconsin out of Milwaukee, Iowa State, and I guess Kentucky, just based on them getting moved because of other teams being closer to where they would be, because Michigan State would be in Cleveland, and I think there's another team that would have been that would end up in Cleveland. So like Wisconsin needs to get ahead of you would think would need to get ahead of Iowa State and Kentucky. And right now Bracket Matrix has both of them ahead of them as 3 seeds. Wisconsin is the top number 4 seed. Jerry Palm still has Wisconsin as a 3 seed. Some of these brackets have them as 5 seeds, and then obviously Joe Lenardi has them a 4. So it's kind of all over the place, isn't it? And it's going to be tough. I'm not saying that you can't overcome that loss to Penn State. Good wins usually overwhelm bad losses. And if you look at some of the teams that could potentially be ahead of Wisconsin, Iowa State has a couple bad losses. Purdue has a loss to that same Penn State team. So it's a situation where this type of stuff is fluid. And as we talk about it today, it's one thing. And when we talk about it Thursday night after Wisconsin plays, and maybe something else happens in a conference tournament elsewhere that helps the Badgers, because there's going to be upsets, and you just hope if you're Wisconsin that it's not you. that you're winning Thursday, and then you're getting another chance at UCLA on Friday to get to Saturday. I mean, you get an opportunity to beat a team that already beat you, and a team that you tied for the best record, or I should say not the best record, but the 4th best record in the Big Ten. So there are opportunities for Wisconsin to get back to that 3. I just don't know if it's going to be enough to jump over a couple of other teams that are playing some pretty good basketball right now.
I would think Wisconsin would have to win 2 games in the Big Ten tournament to realistically feel good about a 3 seed potentially in Milwaukee. And yeah, obviously that has to do with what some other teams do that's out of Wisconsin's control. But you beat either Northwestern or Minnesota, and then you beat an NCAA tournament team that already beat you in UCLA. You get to the semifinal of the Big Ten tournament on Saturday. I think that should be good enough based on the overall body of work and adding another quality win. But it's up to Wisconsin to decide what it's going to do here in Indianapolis. So I think at worst, best case to me is 3 seed. Worst case, I don't know. Do you think they could fall to a 5? Maybe if they lose the first game, because you're 2-4 in your last 6, and you've lost to a couple teams that
aren't playing in the tournament
teams. But that's where things stand in my mind is high is 3, low is 5, and most likely situation is a 4, but it's still fluid, as you said.
Yeah, they really themselves on Saturday. You can lose to Michigan State. You can lose to Oregon. Couldn't lose to Washington, and you couldn't lose to Minnesota. But you can't lose to Penn State. And a team that had nothing to play for, 0 to play for. They weren't playing in the Big Ten tournament. I guess you could say that was their Super Bowl or their March moment, but it just absolutely. I'm not saying it's devastating. They're not dead, right? They're going to get to play on Thursday. They're going to get to play on next Thursday or Friday. It's not like they're dead, but it is not a great feel heading into the postseason the way that they are right now. And it's very similar. Obviously, they faded and didn't make it in 23, and they faded in 24 and gave you a nice run in the Big Ten tournament, but then did show up the following Friday night, the following is it Thursday or Friday? Do you remember?
The James Madison game?
It's irrelevant, but whatever day it was, you know what? I'm pretty sure it was Friday. Friday night, and your season's done. And by next Thursday or Friday at this time, we could be talking about the exact same thing of them fading and not being able to finish a season. I guess maybe that's where we jump into some of these listener questions. Pretty much all of them are just, why is Wisconsin so horrible? But right. But we'll start with this. Why do the late season collapses always seem to happen? That from
always is a big word. The injuries. I think that's got to be part of it. I don't think there's necessarily a through line. I don't think Greg Gard is suddenly not a good coach when 5 games ago he was a potential National Coach of the Year candidate. We did talk about what happens when you don't have a starter in Max Klesman and the way the minute distribution happens. I don't know whether it's just, I don't know that there's something unique to Wisconsin, but I also don't want to make excuses here. Yeah, it's a grind in the Big Ten, but you got to figure out a way to close some of these games out when you've got double-digit leads,
Yeah.
especially in the second half. So I can't say, well, look at what happened last year or 2 years ago. Obviously, we know last year they were sixth in the AP top 25 in January and then never won back-to-back games the rest of the way. This is a different team. Like, obviously, there are some guys back, but John Tanje is an All-American. You didn't have him on the roster last year. It's a different complexion. So they could do something here the next couple of weeks that makes this conversation a moot point. But again, there is this, I think, cloud hanging over the program, certainly from the outside, because of the way they faltered here the last several years. But all of them have involved injuries. The last three.
I wouldn't say all of them involved injuries, right? If you go back to the senior year of Trice and Micah Potter,
The last three.
But was Greg Gard the coach back in those days?
Well, what season are you talking about? Then 1920, 2021?
No, they finished amazingly down the stretch of the 2020 season, right? The 19 and 20. But you go back to the previous year, they faded that year too. The 18-19 year that they went out and got beat up by Oregon in the NCAA tournament, they had played some really good basketball and then faded in March. I know what Greg Gard's answer to this question is. It's injuries, and he told us that, and he tells anybody that will listen that it was that. Like last year, it was Cam and Tyler. It was Cam and was it Tyler Wall last year? Or was the year before with Tyler? I think it was the year before with Tyler. Either way,
Blackwell, and
yes, Blackwell and Cam.
For that, it was Wall was hurt, and Klesmit missed like games, had stitches in his mouth.
And then you had the year before was Johnny Davis getting hurt against Michigan or against Nebraska. That's what that game on Saturday reminded me of a little bit. Like Nebraska, but Wisconsin had already won a share of the Big Ten. They knew that they were going to be playing in Milwaukee, and they lost. But I'm talking about in that Nebraska game.
Oh, right.
Nebraska was horrible that year. I know there's only 14 teams back then, but they were 13th in the Big Ten heading into that one, or they finished 13th in the Big Ten. And so it was a very similar feel to it, but it's different because you had already won a Big Ten and you knew you were going to be Milwaukee. You knew you had a double bye. You knew you were going to be the top seed. So yeah, there was a little bit less to play for against Nebraska, other than an outright Big Ten title, which I think some people still probably are a little not upset about, but wish that that was your trophy and your banner by itself, as opposed to having to share it with Purdue. But 18-19, they faded. They didn't fade in 2020. They definitely faded in 21, 22 injuries, 23 injuries. Also, not very good play. Like, yes, injuries play a part of this, but they just didn't play well either. Last year, I would say play and also injuries. And then this year, I think it's play.
Yeah. I don't have a good explanation as a through
Max played against Oregon, right? He was in that game when they blew a 17-point lead. It's just that is what it is. And then on Saturday, it's Penn State. You shouldn't need all hands on deck to beat Penn State. But the fact that Nolan Winter got hurt in that game and we don't know his status going forward is huge. That's just as big of an injury as losing Max. Perhaps even more, because there's no one like him behind him. Like you don't have somebody that can just come in and replace him. So that's a tough one. But I'm sorry, did you have something else that you wanted to?
No, I don't have an explanation for why it's happened so consistently, other than some of those injuries, but the poor play is a part of it too. It's not like Greg and the staff don't think about what happened in a given year and how can we avoid that moving forward. But it's everything that's happened to date. Kind of, not that it doesn't matter, but they're going to be defined by the next couple of weeks. So they've got a chance to write a totally different story or write the same one and make us have significant questions about whether this program can kind of get over that hump and get to the next step.
Pretty much every single question we got was about their late season fading. So
We don't need to beat a dead horse.
We don't. Brian does ask an overreaction or no question, but it's one that we've kind of already touched on. Saturday, senior day, home loss to Big Ten bottom feeder Penn State locked the Badgers into a best case scenario 3 seed and eliminated any possibility of them playing in Milwaukee, regardless of how many wins they get in the Big Ten tournaments. Is that an overreaction or no?
Overreaction, just because they've got an opportunity to win 4 games. Certainly that, like I said before, even if you win 2, I think it's back in play. It just makes it you have a little more work to do.
Follow up on the Jesse Temple D3 talk. I'm guessing you may have seen this question. Worst loss on Saturday for the Guard family: Greg versus Penn State, or Jeff versus, I believe that's Wisconsin Lutheran.
Okay, Division III soapbox time. It's that portion of the show.
Was that Wisconsin Lutheran?
It was Wisconsin Lutheran.
Okay, all right. Go ahead.
I suddenly this season became reinvested in Division III basketball. And I mentioned this on the last show because Platteville ended up playing Grinnell in the opening round. And I've had an affinity for Grinnell for a while, played against them, and obviously wrote a story on Grinnell earlier this season. And Grinnell played perhaps the worst half of basketball I've ever seen them play. Platteville led 71-34 at the half. And somehow Grinnell scored 63 in the second half and still lost 125-97. But then I was like, all right, so I'm going to follow Platteville here the rest of the way. And they played Wisconsin Lutheran. It was probably the best college basketball game I've seen all year. No hyperbole, prisoner of the moment. So the answer to your question is, without a doubt, the worst loss is the Platteville loss. Platteville led by 13 in the second half, and then Wisconsin Lutheran went on like a 15-0 run. But Platteville led by 2 points in the final seconds, and Lutheran is trying to get a shot off, and the ball goes to the right corner, and a dude on Lutheran heaves a 3-point shot fading away while going out of bounds, and the referees called foul on a 3-point shot with 0.5 seconds left. And the guy on Lutheran took some stones with everything on the line, made the first 2, and the third one rolled out and it went to overtime. And Platteville still ended up losing in overtime 75-73. This was a Platteville team that had just 2 losses, was one of the top teams in Division III, obviously was hosting on its own floor. It was kind of interesting to see the reactions in the bleachers of the Platteville fans who just could not believe what was happening. So their season is over, and that's why the loss is worse. This is back-to-back years where Platteville had a second half collapse, but a year ago it was reaching the Elite Eight, and this year it was in the second round. So it was a hell of a game. I equate the call, by the way, it'd be like if a quarterback threw to his receiver and it was 5 yards over the receiver and the official called pass interference. It's like, well, the dude, he wasn't going to catch it anyway. And my thought was, this 3-point shot was not going to go in anyway. It probably was a foul. I just could not believe that the officials called it in that moment.
It's all about the officials. Always about the officials. No matter the division. Division 1, Division 2, Division 3, it's always about the officials.
The good news is it went to overtime. So, like, Platteville had 5 additional minutes to make it right. But, man, Wisconsin Lutheran, I had never seen before in my life. They've only got 3 losses this year. They are a hell of a team. So, on to the Sweet 16 for Division III hoops this weekend.
And you're going to be following that instead of the Big Ten tournament, right?
Maybe. It might be more interesting.
That's a really good team, though, Jesse. Right?
Yes.
Like, they're 27-3 overall. They went 16-2 in the conference.
Yes.
Right? And so, like, they didn't lose to a bad team. They didn't lose to the second worst team in the conference, to lose not only an opportunity to play, to not have to play until Friday, but also probably the ability to play in Milwaukee. And I get that it's the end of the season, but at least the team they lost to was good.
Oh, I understand that argument. And my argument is Platteville has no more games and led by 13 at home in the second round with just 2 losses all year, where you've worked the entire year for this opportunity. And now you're not playing anymore. And the way that you lost, just absolutely devastating, but
brutal.
Yeah. Brutal. But man, like I will say, both sides, they had some serious stones. Like, there was a stretch there where they were just going back and forth, burying 3-pointers with so much on the line. D3 basketball, man, don't sleep on it.
I have always slept on it, and I probably will continue to sleep on it. But that's okay. That's good. Unless Whitewater's in it, and then I'll pay attention.
UW Lacrosse made the Sweet 16, by the way, if I'm not mistaken. So
congratulations to them. Did you you talk to Grant on Wednesdays? Let him know that they made it because he probably doesn't remember. And probably he's a huge lacrosse guy, unless it actually is paying attention to their sports. So last one here. Kevin says, legitimate question. Besides Purdue, who have the Badgers beaten that was considered an impressive win? Look at that schedule and tell me.
I'm going to look at that schedule.
Arizona.
Illinois is a good win. They beat Illinois by 20 points at the Kohl Center. I mean,
they did. If we talk about Illinois' roster at that moment, we can at least acknowledge that maybe they weren't the Illinois that just has won 3 straight and blew the doors off of a couple of teams. But Arizona's 13th in the net rankings, 14th, Purdue's 14th, Illinois' 15th. They beat them all. Wisconsin is 6-7 in quad 1 games. So, they've beaten some teams, but impressive wins. I don't know. That's a little bit tougher.
Yeah.
Is there anybody like when you look at it? Is there does anything stand out to you?
I don't know. I mean, the Purdue win was a pretty damn good win. I realized the Boilermakers were in the midst of a slide, but at the time they were in the top 10 and you were on the road.
He did say outside of Purdue.
All right. Well, I don't know. It's all relative. They do have the 6 quad 1 wins. They've done what they've needed to do against quad 1, and other than the Penn State game, have generally handled business in the quad 2 through 4 area, which is how you avoid slides. So
right,
we'll see on Thursday.
Yeah, I mean, some of the teams that they would be fighting for to be in Milwaukee against, like Iowa State, 7-2 in quad 1 games, 7-6. 7-2 in quad 2 games, 7-6 in quad 1. So they have one more quad 1 win than Wisconsin. They have Kentucky is 10-9 in quad 1 games and 1-1 in quad 2 games. So those are a couple of teams that have not necessarily. It's not like anybody else's resume is just so much better than Wisconsin's. But again, the SEC and everyone talking it up because it's been very, very impressive helps a team like Kentucky that maybe hasn't just jumped out and hit you in the face every single time they play, but they're in the SEC, and so it's a little bit different. But so prediction-wise here, as Wisconsin goes to Indy, do they win Thursday? No matter who the opponent is, Minnesota or Northwestern, do they win Thursday?
I think they do. I think Wisconsin gets to the semifinal of the Big Ten tournament. I think they win.
Okay, so they beat whoever they play on Thursday, and they beat UCLA on Friday, and they get into they get to face Michigan State again, assuming Michigan State were to get to Saturday. I think Michigan State, again, March is fickle and things change very, very quickly, but they look to be playing as well as any team in the country right now. And I think of all the Big Ten teams, they obviously have the best chance of making a deep run in the tournament and perhaps getting to the Final Four, and maybe with their defense, and maybe they come out shooting really, really well and find a way to, after 25 years, end that streak. Is there anybody else in the conference that you think can do that? I thought at one point this year maybe Wisconsin could, just because of their shooting, but the way that they've shot the last 5 games doesn't give me any confidence there. A team like Maryland, and the way that Illinois, as a healthy Illinois and a not emptying their bowels everywhere, which is what happened much of February, could be a team that could make a run too.
Yeah, you could throw
Michigan sucks in there. Michigan sucks.
I feel like there's really not the great team, which is why I feel like this NCAA tournament is going to be full of parity and upsets, and it's why any of these Big Ten teams could make a run and get there. Now, do you feel great about any of them outside of Michigan State? Probably not. You've got to have something consistent to rely on and something that's a true separator to feel like you would pick that team in every game. But I think it's going to be a wild NCAA tournament, as we've seen in years past, because there aren't the true great teams.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to it. I do think they win on Thursday. I think Friday would be a coin toss against UCLA. I know Wisconsin had a chance there, lost by a few points out in Westwood, but Should be a good matchup, assuming Wisconsin can figure out a way to take the lid off the basket. And, this is 3 straight games without scoring 80 points. And really 4 or 5, take the Washington game out of it, 4 out of 5 where their offense hasn't been clicking nearly as well as it should be. Their defense, though, was as big of an issue as anything on Saturday against Penn State. So
that's what I was going to say is don't allow Mara to come off and go 7 for 7 from the field and score 24 points. Like, stop letting big men overwhelm you. And if you do that, you have a chance and make some shots.
Yep. We'll see. And we'll see if they'll get it done. They'll be in action early on Thursday afternoon against either Minnesota or Northwestern. We'll be back once we have a bracket, talk all about it as Wisconsin gets ready for NCAA tournament action next week. Jesse, thank you very much.
Thanks, Zach.
All right, there he is. Jesse Temple from The Athletic. You've been listening to The Swing.